Look at this stretch of pavement, a parking lot cracked at the edges, weeds pushing up through the seams, maybe a highway on-ramp curves nearby, indifferent, 4 lanes of traffic moving over what used to be someone's front yard. 60 years ago, this was a street. There was a church on the corner. You could hear the choir from half a block away on Sunday mornings, a grocery store, a barber shop where men argued about baseball and politics in the same breath. Children walked to a school 3 blocks down, past houses where their grandparents had been born. None of it is marked. No plaque, no sign, nothing in the city's official history that says a community lived here and it was whole. This isn't one place. It's a pattern, repeated across this country more times than most people will ever know. Black communities that built something real, something self-sustaining, and then watched it get taken apart piece by piece. Sometimes overnight, sometimes over decades. By fire, by bulldozer, by a stroke of a pen on a zoning map. The official story calls it progress, urban renewal, eminent domain, the greater good. But maps don't lie by accident. What gets drawn, and what gets erased, tells you exactly who held the pen. Tonight, we're going to walk through 12 of these places. Some you may have heard whispers of, most you probably haven't. And that's not an accident either. By the early 20th century, Haiti wasn't just a black neighbourhood. It was an engine. Walk down Fayetteville Street in 1920 and you'd pass the headquarters of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance, the largest black-owned business in America at the time. Banks, hotels, theatres showing first-run films, doctors' offices, law practices, a hospital that served patients regardless of what other institutions in Durham would or wouldn't do. People called it Black Wall Street too, and Durham's version had survived, had grown, had become something close to a self-contained city within a city. Then came the 1960s, and with them, Highway 147. The Durham Freeway was routed directly through the heart of Haiti. Officials called it slum clearance. They called it modernization. What it actually did was sever the neighborhood's main commercial corridor, displace thousands of residents, and demolish more than 400 businesses. Today, drive that stretch of 147 and you're driving over what was once one of the most prosperous black commercial districts in the South. A few buildings remain, fragments really, surrounded by overpasses and parking structures. The Haiti Heritage Center keeps a memory alive in one preserved church, but the neighborhood itself, the grid of streets and storefronts and homes that made it a community, gone under asphalt. Nobody burned Haiti down, they just built a road through it, and called that an improvement. Rondo Avenue ran through the heart of St. Paul's largest black neighborhood, a community of roughly 7,000 people, most of whom owned their homes. That detail matters. In an era when black home ownership was systematically blocked almost everywhere else, Rondo residents had built equity, stability, generational roots. There were black-owned funeral homes, pharmacies, social clubs, a community newspaper, a rhythm to the place, porches full of people in summer, kids running between yards that didn't have fences because everyone knew everyone. In the late 1950s, the interstate highway system arrived, and planners chose to route Interstate 94 directly through Rondo, despite alternative routes that would have avoided the neighborhood entirely. Families received notices. Some had weeks to find new housing in a city where redlining made that nearly impossible. Homes were bulldozed in front of the people who'd lived in them. By the time construction finished, Rondo as a physical place had ceased to exist, replaced by a sunken trench of concrete and traffic. Every summer now, there's a festival, Rondo Days, where former residents and their descendants gather to remember. It's a beautiful thing. It's also a kind of mourning, because what they're celebrating is a memory of a place that the city itself made sure could never be rebuilt. Before it had that name, the soil here was actually dark and rich, hence Black Bottom. By the 20th century it had become something else, one of the most vibrant black neighborhoods in the urban north, packed with jazz clubs, churches, family businesses, and a density of community life that visitors described as electric. Paradise Valley, its commercial heart, hosted some of the greatest musicians of the era. This was a place with its own economy, its own nightlife, its own gravitational pull. In the 1950s, Detroit's urban renewal program, backed by federal funding, targeted Black Bottom for slum clearance. The neighborhood was almost entirely demolished. In its place, the Chrysler Freeway, and later a development called Lafayette Park, designed notably with very few black residents in mind. The people displaced didn't just lose buildings, they lost the dense social fabric that had taken generations to weave, the kind of thing that doesn't transplant easily into scattered public housing across the city. Drive through that part of Detroit today and you'll see green space, a freeway, modern apartment towers, nothing that hints at what stood there. The bottom of the city, it turns out, was easier to bury than to remember. Out in California's Central Valley, in the early 1900s, a man named Allenssworth, a former enslaved person who became a US Army chaplain, co-founded a town meant to be entirely self-governed by black Americans. Allenssworth had its own school district, its own justice of the peace, its own library, its own farms. For a brief window, it worked. The town grew. It had ambitions of becoming a real agricultural and educational hub, a place where black families could build wealth and pass it down without the constant interference of white-controlled local governments. Then, the water disappeared. The railroad, which had promised water rights as part of the town's founding, shifted its station location, and with it the water access the town depended on. Drought followed. Without water, the agricultural base that sustained Allenssworth collapsed. Families left one by one, looking for land that could actually be farmed. By the mid-20th century, Allenssworth was a ghost town. Today it exists as a state historic park, a handful of restored buildings standing in dry grassland, visited mostly by school groups on field trips. It wasn't burned, it wasn't bulldozed, it was simply starved, denied the one resource that made everything else possible. And when a community runs dry, the history books rarely ask why the water stopped flowing in the first place. Mississippi's Delta region was once home to a constellation of all-black towns, communities founded by formerly enslaved people who pooled resources to buy land directly from plantation owners after emancipation. Mound Bayou was the most famous, a town with its own banks, its own cotton gins, its own newspaper, founded explicitly on the principle of black self-governance. For decades, these towns functioned as proof of concept, evidence that black communities, given land and left alone, could build thriving local economies. Left alone turned out to be the operative phrase. Mechanization of agriculture in the mid-20th century gutted the economic base these towns depended on. But mechanization didn't happen in a vacuum. It arrived alongside systematic denial of agricultural loans to black farmers, alongside tax assessments that conveniently increased right when land became valuable, alongside 1,000 small administrative decisions that, individually, looked like nothing. Collectively, they were a slow drain. Population hemorrhaged out through the Great Migration. Tax bases collapsed, schools closed, businesses shuttered one by one with no investment ever arriving to replace them. Mound Bayou still exists technically, but it's a fraction, a shadow of what it was meant to become. And the towns around it that didn't have its name recognition, many of them simply faded off the map entirely, absorbed into larger municipalities or left as unincorporated clusters of houses with no name anyone outside the county would recognize. Africa Town's origin story is almost impossible to believe, except that it's documented extensively right down to the ship. In 1860, decades after the international slave trade had been outlawed, the Clotilda illegally transported a group of captive Africans to Mobile Bay. After emancipation, those survivors, unable to return home, unwilling to remain on land controlled by the people who'd enslaved them, pooled what little money they had and bought their own land. They built their own town, kept their own language and customs alive for generations, built churches, schools, a self-sufficient community founded by people who had survived something almost no one else alive had survived. For decades, Africa Town thrived as a tight-knit, culturally distinct community. Then, in the 20th century, industry arrived. Paper mills, chemical plants, a highway of course. Interstate 165, cut directly through the community in the 1990s. Decade after decade of heavy industrial zoning surrounded Africa Town on every side, filling the air with pollutants and the soil with contaminants that residents say have caused disproportionate rates of cancer and respiratory illness in the community. The wreck of the Clotilda itself was finally confirmed in the riverbed in 2019. Found, fittingly, buried in mud for over a century, much like the community's history had been buried under industrial sprawl. Some descendants still live in Africa Town, but the population is a fraction of what it once was, surrounded by smokestacks, breathing air that the people who founded this place, people who survived the Middle Passage, never should have had to breathe. In January of 1923, Rosewood was a small, self-sufficient black community, Homes, churches, a school, a Masonic lodge, families who owned their land outright. Within a week, it no longer existed. A white woman in a nearby town claimed she'd been assaulted by a black man. There was no evidence. It didn't matter. A mob formed, and over several days that mob burned Rosewood to the ground, building by building. Survivors fled into the swamps, hiding for days in freezing January conditions while their homes burned behind them. An unknown number of people were killed. Estimates vary because no thorough official investigation was ever conducted at the time. Afterward, survivors scattered. Most never returned. Land that had been owned by black families for generations was sold off, often for a fraction of its value, often under direct threat, to white buyers who'd participated in or benefited from the destruction. For nearly 70 years, Rosewood was barely mentioned anywhere. Not in Florida history textbooks, not in local records beyond a few terse mentions. It took until 1994 for the state of Florida to even formally acknowledge what happened, and to offer compensation to survivors and their descendants, by which point most of the people who'd lived through it were gone. Today, Rosewood is essentially nothing. A historical marker on the side of the road. Few houses, none connected to the original community. The town simply isn't there anymore. Not destroyed gradually, not displaced by a highway. Erased in days, and then erased again from memory for 7 decades after that. You may know the name. Black Wall Street, the wealthiest black community in America at the time. A thriving 35-block district with its own hospital, its own newspapers, hotels, theatres, law offices, and a level of black-owned wealth that was, for its era, almost unheard of anywhere in the country. In June of 1921, over the course of less than 24 hours, it was wiped out. A white mob, reportedly assisted by aerial attacks dropping incendiary devices, an almost unthinkable detail that took decades to be widely acknowledged, burned Greenwood to the ground. Somewhere between 100 and 300 people were killed. Thousands were left homeless overnight. Insurance claims were denied across the board, on the grounds that the damage had resulted from a riot, a clause specifically written to exclude this kind of destruction from coverage. Survivors rebuilt against staggering odds. Greenwood actually came back smaller in the years that followed. And then, decades later, urban renewal and a highway project finished what the fire started, cutting through what remained of the rebuilt district and finishing the displacement the original massacre hadn't completed. For most of the 20th century, the Tulsa Race Massacre was nearly absent from Oklahoma's own history curriculum. An entire generation of Oklahomans grew up a few miles from the site without ever being taught it happened. The wealth that was destroyed in those 24 hours, generational wealth, the kind that compounds and gets passed down, never came back. Economists who've studied it estimate the long-term impact in the hundreds of millions of dollars, money that simply never existed for the descendants of Greenwood's families. You can't legislate that back. You can only calculate what was taken. Before there was a park, there was a village. In the 1820s, free black New Yorkers began buying land in what was then a rural area of Manhattan, far from the overcrowded, often hostile conditions downtown. Seneca Village grew into a stable community of homeowners, with churches, a school, and, significantly, enough property ownership among black residents that, at a time when only property owners could vote, Seneca Village gave a meaningful number of black New Yorkers access to the ballot. By the 1850s, it was home to roughly 250 residents, most of them black, alongside Irish and German immigrant families. Then the city decided it needed a park. In 1857, the city used eminent domain to seize the entire area, homes, churches, the cemetery, for the construction of Central Park. Residents were given some compensation, though often well below the value of what they'd built. Within months, the village was demolished completely. What makes Seneca Village distinct is what happened next. Nothing. No marker, no mention, for well over a century. Generations of New Yorkers walked through that section of Central Park, joggers, tourists, families with picnic blankets, with absolutely no idea that an entire community had once stood beneath their feet. It wasn't until archaeological excavations in the 1990s that the physical evidence of the village was even confirmed. Foundations, artifacts, the literal buried remains of homes. One of the most visited green spaces on Earth, and for nearly a century and a half it kept this secret in its soil. Across the rural South and parts of Appalachia, a lesser-known pattern repeats. Small, often unincorporated black farming communities, sometimes just a few dozen families, with a church, a cemetery, a one-room schoolhouse, submerged entirely under reservoirs created by federal dam projects in the mid-20th century. These were communities that often predated the surrounding white towns by generations. Land acquired after emancipation in places nobody else wanted, which the families then made productive through generations of labour. When the Army Corps of Engineers or the Tennessee Valley Authority identified a valley for a reservoir, the communities in the flood zone were relocated, sometimes with minimal compensation, sometimes with none at all if land titles had never been formally recorded, which was common for black landowners who'd acquired property through informal arrangements in the post-emancipation South. Cemeteries, in some documented cases, were not relocated before the flooding, which means that right now, today, there are bodies of black Americans, ancestors, named individuals, resting at the bottom of reservoirs that families drive past, swim in, fish in, with no idea what's beneath the surface. There's no single name for this category of erasure because that's exactly the point. It happened in dozens of small undocumented instances, each one too minor on its own to make headlines, each one part of a pattern too large and too dispersed to ever be added up into a single number. Throughout the post-emancipation South, formerly enslaved people frequently established small settlements on land they considered their own, sometimes through informal purchase, sometimes through simple occupation of land nobody else wanted, sometimes through verbal agreements with former enslavers that were never legally formalized. Many of these settlements never appeared on official maps at all. Census takers, frequently hostile or simply uninterested, undercounted or entirely skipped these communities. Local governments often refused to extend services, roads, schools, mail delivery, to areas they didn't formally recognize, which in turn meant these places generated even less of a paper trail. Decades later, when descendants or local historians have tried to document these settlements, they've often run into a wall: county records that show nothing, maps that show empty land, census data with gaps exactly where the community should be. In some cases, the only evidence that these places existed at all comes from family Bibles, oral histories passed down through generations, and physical traces, old foundation stones, cemetery plots in places no map acknowledges as a cemetery, place names that locals still use informally but that appear on no official document. When a community's existence depends entirely on people remembering it out loud, and those people are aging, and their children are scattered across cities far from where their family's history actually happened, the erasure doesn't require any further action. It just requires waiting. Somewhere in the rural South, and we're being intentionally vague here, because in a sense this isn't really about one specific place. There are settlements that exist in almost no records at all, not because anyone burned them, not because a highway came through, because they were never counted to begin with. Picture a cluster of homes, a small church, maybe 20 or 30 families, founded sometime in the late 1800s by people who'd been enslaved on a nearby plantation, and who, after emancipation, simply stayed on a corner of land nobody contested because nobody wanted it. No deed was ever filed. No census taker ever made the trip down that particular road. Or if one did, the names were recorded wrong, or not recorded at all, or recorded under the name of the white landowner whose property the community technically sat on, according to the only paperwork that existed. For a few generations the community persisted. People were born there, married there, were buried in a cemetery with handmade headstones. Wood, mostly, which doesn't last. Then, gradually, as it does everywhere, the economic pressure of the 20th century pulled the young people towards cities. The old people passed away. The wooden markers in the cemetery rotted and fell and were swallowed by the ground. Today, if you stood on that land, you'd see trees. Maybe the depression of an old foundation, barely visible under leaf litter, the kind of thing you'd walk past without a second look unless you already knew what you were looking for. There's no name on a map for this place, because there never was one to begin with. No records to request because none were filed. No descendants association, because the descendants don't know to look for it. The family stories that survived simply say down south or back home, without the specificity that would let anyone trace it back. This is the part that should sit with you. Not Haiti, not Greenwood, not even Rosewood. As devastating as those are, they at least exist somewhere, in some record, in some memory, in some name we can say out loud. This last one doesn't even have that. It's not a story of a community that was destroyed. It's a story of a community that may as well have never been documented as existing, which, as far as official history is concerned, is functionally the same thing as never existing at all. And if that's true, If an entire community can pass through this world, build something, live and die and raise children and bury its dead, and leave behind nothing that the official record will ever recognize, then the question isn't really how many places like this are there. The question is, how would we ever know if there were thousands? The map only shows what someone, at some point, decided was worth marking. Everything else, every name, every street, every family, every grave, exists only as long as someone remembers to say it out loud. And memory, unlike a map, doesn't get filed anywhere permanent. It just runs out.